to kick things off and to introduce our first speaker, I'm so glad to hand things over to our still our new Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Margaret Everett. Margaret.
Thanks so much, Jason. Hi, everyone. It is really great to see such a great turnout tonight. I'm going to keep my remarks brief and introduce our speaker in a minute, but let me start by saying thank you sincerely to all of you who've joined together tonight for this presentation, our inaugural presentation in the series on Hidden Truths. And I want to say a special thank you to all the people who have put this series together, and I'm sure that I'm not going to name everyone, so my apologies in advance, but Laura DeMore, Jason Jacobs, Laura Turner, Brian Hendrickson, thank you all so much for the work you've put into this. I'm really proud of our faculty for stepping up at a really critical time in our community and in our country, frankly, and putting together a really meaningful series that I think is going to allow us to have some really important dialogue over the next several months. So, as I said, tonight is the first in a series of presentations and discussions about local histories. We're all aware of the national context in which we're all called on with appropriate urgency to reckon with racial injustice and a history of systematic oppression. And I see in that context really a mosaic of thousands of local stories, often marginalized, hidden, dismissed, misrepresented. I'm so grateful, as I said, to our faculty, to our alumni, our community partners for putting together this vital series. And I really believe that facing the truths of our past and present, though painful, is really a positive foundation for action toward a more inclusive and just future. How we remember what we remember really matters in material ways, I believe. So thanks again to everyone who's helped put this together. Thank you all for joining us. And it's really my pleasure to welcome tonight's presenter, who's a fellow anthropologist, so it's a special pleasure. Jeremy Campbell is, Dr. Jeremy Campbell is an associate professor of anthropology. I bet a lot of you know him well, at Roger Williams University, and the director of the University Honors Program. Dr. Campbell specializes in land conflicts and environmental politics in the Brazilian Amazon, where he's conducted ethnographic research alongside Indigenous peoples and other traditional communities for the past 20 years. His lecture tonight will explore the history of the Poconoke Nation, the original inhabitants of the Bristol and Greater East Bay area and their ancestral land. So with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Campbell.
Thank you very much, Provost Everett. Thank you for that warm introduction. And let me just underline one thing that you said, that how we remember what we remember is so vital. And I think that might be a nice way into the material today. Thank you so much, Dr. Diamore, Dr. Turner, Dean Jacobs, Dr. Hendrickson, for all the hard work and for the invitation. It's a privilege to be given the task of starting off this year-long series called Hidden Truths, Stories of Race and Place. And let me just take a moment to share my screen, sorry, before I get too far away. Here we go. Hopefully you all don't mind me taking control of your screen for the next 45 minutes or so. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Provost Everett, again. The title of my talk is before you right now, Decolonizing Sowams, Resisting the Erasure of Indigenous Lives in the East Bay of Rhode Island. And I think it's appropriate since the Hidden Truth series invites us to sort of excavate and really consider some of those stories and some of those truths that may have been marginalized or hidden from view, those thousand at least stories of place that we bump into or ignore in our daily lives. I think it would be absolutely appropriate for us to start tonight with an acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples plural, that continue to inhabit, are the history of the lands that Roger Williams University calls home, but continue to be here as well. So I'm going to read this land acknowledgement and then say just a little bit about it before diving into give you kind of an overview of what I hope we can talk about tonight. I should also say that thank you for being muted. Thank you for not sharing your video, but do familiarize yourself with the chat feature. The chat feature is open to all. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and pop them into the chat. Probably not going to be referring to them until the end when we get to the Q&A, but that would be something to avail yourself of for sure. So we recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We acknowledge that Roger Williams University's Bristol and Providence campuses are located within the homelands of both the Poconoke and Narragansett nations. Let this acknowledgement serve as a reminder of our ongoing efforts to reconcile and partner with the Narragansett and Poconoke and all Indigenous peoples whose lands and water benefit from today. So a land acknowledgement, as many of you know, is a sort of ceremonial, a kind of ritual opening, a kind of first gasp before focus on the issue might be in a meeting or in, let's say, a commencement or some kind of big ceremonial event. It's a way to take a breath, take a pause, remember and acknowledge and try to connect to stories that are in many cases ancient and deep, but also that carry forth to the present, right? And so this is a statement that is the result of collective efforts, a partnership between Roger Williams University students, faculty, administrators, representatives of the Poconoke Nation, representatives of the Narragansett Nation, to try to really lean into that the legacy and the continued sort of vibrancy of Indigenous peoples here in Rhode Island. I'm happy to say that this land acknowledgement or versions of it appear in faculty syllabi. They are being used at events like this, conferences and whatnot. And as a university, I think we're reckoning with kind of the commitments that a statement like this could be bringing us into. So it's a very exciting thing to sort of start off with. And of course, content appropriate today as we talk about decolonizing Sowams. So 4 things that are kind of the main objectives of my talk tonight. The first thing will be to really dive into what we mean when we say decolonization and its various cognates. To decolonize a place or decolonize so what is it and what does it and how does it matter? Why should this be something that we in the university or we in society more generally should be concerning ourselves with? Then, I'll answer the question and try to, catch you up on, if you don't know, what exactly we mean by Sowams, what that refers to as a place name. Then I'll present a brief overview. There's 400 plus years kind of in 6 slides, a history of the Poconoke Nation to provide you with some of the vital stories, some of the vital context that perhaps you didn't know, being a resident of Bristol or being new to Roger Williams. The history of the Poconoke Nation is in some ways an incredibly important history to understand to be a Rhode Islander or what it means to be indeed an American because of the role that the Poconoke Nation played in colonial times. But again, I want to stress that their vibrancy and their vitality continues down through the 21st century. So with those stories sort of brought to light, the final thing we'll do is look at Bristol and surrounding areas anew with some of those hidden truths in mind. Since I'm an educator and as well as a researcher, I live by the credo that you really can't learn much from someone whom you can't identify with or kind of connect to. So I want to tell you a little bit about me. By way of beginning, I want to say that the story that I'm about to tell is not my story. It's not by any means anywhere close to my story, but I do tell this story with the full permission and encouragement of the Poconoke Nation. In these lands, I'm a settler. I've lived here for 11 years. And in that time, I've had the privilege of coming to know more about this place than first meets the eye. But this is not my story, nor is it my realm of academic expertise. As the provost said, I'm an Amazonianist. I work as an outsider, again, owning my position with Indigenous peoples on a range of issues in the Brazilian Amazon, which include things like land titling and environmental threats, their responses to environmental threats. But even within that context, there's very little in my professional life that prepares me to speak with authority on decolonizing Sowams. So instead of speaking with authority, I speak as a settler, one of millions of settlers in this country who enjoy privileges that arise as the result of the historic and ongoing oppression of Indigenous peoples in this continent. So I want to squarely sort of own that position. And I encourage you to as well. I'm presuming, perhaps it's folly, but I'm presuming that many of you are settlers as well. Depending, and we can unpack that term a little bit as well. But from settler to settler, I want to invite you to consider some of what I'm offering here. And all of what I'm offering here is the result of a year-plus long collaboration that I've had together with my students in the honors program and in the anthropology program, together with colleagues like Charlotte Carrington-Farmer and Brian Hendrickson, and together with community groups like the Sowams Area Heritage Project. We've collaborated with the tribe to begin to try to aid their efforts, the Poconoke Nation's efforts, to publicize their story, to bring their story more to the front, because many Bristolians, many Rhode Islanders simply don't know it. So everything I'm going to say tonight has been the result of meetings, interviews, documentary sorts of deep dives into the material and oral history of a people. And it's my humble privilege to be able to share it. During the question and answer, I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'm going to defer when I don't know, because again, this is not my story, and I think that's important. It's important in part because owning the identity or owning the stance as a settler invites you to sort of consider what it might mean to decolonize your life, or to decolonize your institution, or decolonize your sensibility about history, the histories that matter, the histories that shape our lives. And to sort of explain and explore a little bit more what decolonization means, it's helpful to take a cue from the two scholars whom you see in the upper left of your screen, Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, who are Indigenous scholars in the field of critical Indigenous studies. And they remind us very sort of passionately that decolonization takes work. It takes material striving. It takes the effort to consider what you might not know you don't know. And in that way, decolonization is not a metaphor. It can't be sort of suffused in other sorts of well-meaning justice-oriented work, which is no slight against justice-oriented work or collaboration or solidarity. But decolonization is a very specific way of talking about how we need to become more aware of how settler colonialism has sprung into existence, has supported institutions that continue again to or shield from view Indigenous realities. So decolonization at its heart interrupts the logic of settler colonialism. And that term, bear with me with that term if that one's a little bit confusing, but essentially what settler colonialism does without us even knowing it is that it sort of posits a view. It sets out a sort of understanding, implicit often, but also explicit in the teachings that we give our, for example, kindergarten through 12th grade sort of education curriculum in this country. The view that Indigenous peoples are either vanquished and somehow in the past, right, always referred to in the past tense, or readily or just about to be assimilated into the value systems of the broader society. And of course, that broader society that we default to, of what kind of country we are, what the United States is a society whose institutions, courts, police, the educational system, private property are made by and for settlers. And I would go farther, and I think later on in this series, you'll be able to grapple with histories whereby it's not just that settlers benefit from courts, police, education system, private property, but certain kinds of settlers at certain historical junctures, right? So an intersectional sort of approach to these questions is absolutely baked into decolonial work. But it's grappling first with what settler colonialism is all about and the ways in which it sets us up to perhaps presume that indigenous peoples are all gone, historical in the past tense, or somehow sort of half citizens. So to kind of quickly compare settler history, what we all learn often, kind of orthodox history, sets colonialism as a discrete historical event, something that's in the past, right? So if we're thinking of North American history, we might say 1776 is the end of the colonial era. If we're a little that we might say, well, you know, the United States was still just hugging the Atlantic coastline. And so the era of manifest destiny in the 19th century is colonial sort of epic as well. But as soon as that's finished, it's again in the past. Indigenous perspectives see colonization as a continuous process, something that is continuing to happen. And it takes the following forms at minimum. One is that colonization excludes indigenous histories from view. So occlusion is the act of kind of covering up or looking away from, right? So the history is still there. It's still able to be perceived, but you got to go out of your way. You got to know who to talk to. You got to make outstanding efforts because it's not part of our public discussion of history. So that's a colonial process. Colonization continues to see indigenous lands. It perpetuates this idea that indigenous lands are national sacrifice zones. For example, the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? Sacrificing the indigenous land and indigenous, understandings of land to the greater good of the country's economic development, right? Or out west in the Nevada Test Site Range, where Shoshone and Ute territory sacred sites have been blasted by nuclear tests over the years. So seeing indigenous lands as sacrifice zones, as places that really are too big for so few people. And we've got 330 million people, so let's just take their land and do what we want with it. These are continual processes again. Oh, sorry. And then finally, colonization through indigenous eyes is a continuous process because it continues to parody, denigrate, or really affect violence on indigenous bodies. There's an epidemic in this continent of missing and kidnapped and murdered indigenous women throughout the continent. Not just talking about a particular place, right? And that story gets occluded from view, but there's also colonial structures that continue to perpetuate that sort of violence. The parodying of indigenous bodies, the mascots, both at the professional level, but also many of your high schools perhaps, kind of treating culture as this kind of pantomime sort of thing that can be, easily sort of poked fun at. So these are ways, again, in which colonization has not ended. So a useful way to think about colonization, and this might be new for many of us, is that it's not an event, it's a process. It's not something that happened and then was over, but instead it's a continuous process. And one thing I like to say is that if we're really interested in decolonization, then the first step for us is to understand how colonization and the colonial context kind of provides us ways to think about the continued marginalization and the continued kind of dispossession of Native peoples, right? So once we understand that colonization is ongoing, we can sort of understand how we are complicit in those processes, which are processes of public memory. They're processes of enjoying the privileges of a settler colonial democracy, like private property, like the ability to vote, like my ability to easily move to a new state, right? 11 years ago, and because I wanted to sort of begin to research the history, but that itself is a privilege of access, a privilege of being able to move my capital from one place to another, meager as it was, right? And invest in a new place. So this way of thinking, this lens begins to open up ways to think about how we can untangle the legacies of colonialism that continue to accrue privileges for some while marginalizing and ostracizing others. Some of the things that we need to consider then is who gets to decide the history that our public places tell. The image on the right here of the 4th of July parade in 2018 in Bristol. Bristol has a very sort of clear story of itself that is abundantly clear when you come as a first-time visitor, right? The red, white, and blue stripe down Hope Street and down High Street, the bunting, the beautiful manicured lawns. It feels like a colonial sort of paradise, almost like a colonial Disneyland, and very patriotic, right? Almost as if downtown, the clock has been set to 1776 or shortly after the Revolution. That's on purpose. That's the result of particular choices that people are making and that people have become accustomed to. It ends up sort of marginalizing or occluding other forms of history, other stories that are, I would offer, as important, if not more important than that particular congratulatory image of Bristol that Bristol puts out, that the East Bay puts out, that Rhode Island puts out for that matter. So who gets to decide what our public history looks like? This is exactly the story exactly the question that's being pursued in the streets as Christopher Columbus statues come down, as Confederate statues become either torn down or recontextualized. Right? So it's very relevant to broader themes. This question, does living on stolen land bestow special obligations on us? This is a difficult question, and one which we probably reject on its face because we don't have the kind of empathetic and maybe comparative muscles to sort of consider, oh, wow, this land that I feel like I have a deed to, or I feel like I've paid my dues to achieve, what is its deeper history? What are the continued valences through which it becomes meaningful to people other than me, right? Does the gap between those two things then necessitate action on my part to work towards diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice? Because Indigenous Rhode Islanders are here and they're now. They're not gone, right? They haven't been vanquished. So we would be good to ask, what does decolonization mean to them? And how can non-Indigenous settlers work in alliance with them to achieve some of those goals? So as promised, I want to get into kind of what Sowams refers to. We've got a few watchwords, a few concepts that we can begin to work on: settler colonialism, decolonization, as ways to try to work through and open our minds to knowing things that we might not have known, or things that we might have been taught a certain way, but here's another take on it that comes directly from Indigenous oral tradition and documentary evidence. So that's the invitation. Now let's get down to some of the geography. I'm going to show you a lot of maps. I'm also going to go through, again, 400 years of history relatively quickly. Sowams is a place name. It means southern country in the Eastern Algonquian dialects. Many of the Eastern Algonquian dialects have Sowams or Sowamsi, meaning place to the south, especially in the connotation of a place to the south near the water. So hopefully you can see here Sowams Bay on the western side here of this map. This is a 1908 map commissioned by the state of Rhode Island by Thomas W. Bicknell. He was the cartographer to try to affix native place names to places in Rhode Island. Some of these place names are very much still with us, like Papasquash Neck, Tuisset Neck, Seekonk, of course, a native place name, Potumtuk, Otsumqui up here. Others have been lost to memory. Others have been reappropriated. But Sowams generally refers to this area along the Sowams Bay, which would have been the Poconoke and other native groups' reference term for this body of water that we know today as Mount Hope Bay, or Narragansett Bay. Sorry, Mount Hope Bay is over here. And specifically, a series of villages in what's now Barrington, Warren, and then down into Bristol as well. So it was the sort of capital of the Poconoke Nation at of the arrival of the Pilgrims in the 17th century. One other sort of interesting note, and it's very important for what I'm about to get into later on, is that on this map, down here where the asterisk is, you'll see M-O-N-T-A-U-P given listed for what the Poconoke know as Potumtuk and what you may know as Mount Hope. So just to orient you, the Roger Williams campus is here, right? And about 2 miles to the north-northeast is a place that is now known as Mount Hope Farm, which is a public park, Bristol town property. It's sort of half of that area. The other half belongs to Brown University and has played various roles over the years. But the Poconoke know this land as Potumtuk, or lookout of the Poconoke. And indeed, it is a lookout. It is a high bluff. Montauk was probably also used for the area for that by other groups, non-Poconoke groups, because Montauk means rise near the water. It's related to Montauk, down on the eastern edge of Long Island, right? So a bluff that overlooks the water is a Montauk, but Potumtuk is the rising place or the lookout of the Poconoke people. So I'm going to be saying Poconoke. I'm sorry, I'm going to be saying Potumtuk a lot tonight, and I'm referring to Mount Hope, which is again just 2 miles up the road from the Roger Williams University campus. The Poconoke in the 17th century were an incredibly influential and important tribe in a broader ecology of tribal nations in southern New England. And indeed, the Eastern Algonquian speaking peoples stretched from New Brunswick in the north all the way down to the tidewater of Virginia, speaking the same language, not practicing exactly the same culture, and certainly not having isomorphic political systems that fit one into the other, but nevertheless, from New Brunswick all the way down to the tidewaters of Virginia, and make your own way using different varieties of a dialect that were mutually intelligible, and which come down today to us as the Eastern Algonquian languages. And so the Poconoke, you can see in this map from 1978, the Smithsonian Institution, basically dominated the southeastern quadrant of New England, including this area, the Bristol Peninsula, and areas around here. The Narragansetts were neighbors and continue to be neighbors to the west. The Massachusetts and the Nipmuc at various times paid tribute actually to the Poconoke. And the Poconoke kind of royal line was established in Sowams. Oh dear, I hope my connection's still good. I'm just gonna keep talking until someone tells me that they can't hear me. Sowams, so what we now know as Bristol, right, is the place where Massasoit Otsumqui, Massasoit is a title, his son Massasoit Wamsutta took over when Otsumqui died, and when Wamsutta died, King Philip, Po Metacom, and Metacom should ring a bell because Metacom Avenue became the next Massasoit. All residents of this place, all principal sachems, principal leaders, great sachems, great leaders, Massasoits of the Poconoke Nation. So many different villages, many tributary peoples as well, who essentially paid tribute to the Poconoke Massasoits in return for protection, in return for access to fields, in return for kinship relations, these sorts of things. So it's no accident that we are sort of focused on them right now, because right now is also the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. So I'll point out Plymouth here on the map as well. And when the Pilgrims arrived, they first interacted with Poconoke natives who were dominant down through the Cape and all the way up to into Massachusetts. At this point, it's only appropriate that we hear a little bit from the Poconoke and from the seated Sagamore, the head chief of the nation, Sagamore Po Waupi Niampog, which translates to Winds of Thunder, Bill Guy. He is the 9th great-grandson, all documented all the way back to Po Metacom. He's pictured here sitting in King Philip's seat at Potumtuk. And this film, he's also seated at the seat of King Philip, which was a traditional and continues to be a gathering place, a council place, where elders and powasses or medicine people would confer and deliberate certain things. It no doubt was at or near King Philip's seat that King Philip's father, Otsumqui, first learned of the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620 and first began to confer with his sachems and powasses this sort. So it's an incredibly important place, again, just 2 miles up the road. And let's hear what the Sagamore has to say about the history of the Poconoke people.
The history of the Poconoke tribe actually was the headship tribe of what you call the Wampanoag Nation today. But when the English came to this country, this whole area was known as Poconoke country, or King Philip country later on. Any map prior to the King Philip War will stay right on it, Poconoke country. So Wampanoag is a name that was given to us during the King Philip War, around the year 1675, 1676, when the colonists outlawed the word Poconoke and made it illegal for you, if you were male 14 years of age or older, to say you were Poconoke. And they started calling us Wampanoag at that time. And that was a law that was on the books until after the year 2000. And if you were 14 years of age or older and you were male, they would kill you on sight. If you said you were Poconoke, they could kill you on sight. So basically, the word Poconoke, a lot of people don't recognize. But this is who we are, and just last year, we took back Poconoke Nation.
Right. So, again, Sagamore, Winds of Thunder, presenting just a little bit about that moment, the kind of earth-shattering moment of Poconoke interactions with settlers from England, right? It turned out to be a tragic sort of story, but it didn't start out as a tragic story. And even before we get to that singular event that is King Philip's War, we need to set maybe an even broader context, which is that 12,000 years before the present, just as the Laurentide glacial ice sheet was retreating back from Long Island and Block Island and heading north, archaeological evidence suggests that the ancestors of contemporary Algonquian-speaking groups began to move into this area, first as foragers and in due succession as settlers themselves, as complex agriculturists. These cultures, by the time of the 15th and 16th century, right on the eve of the arrival of Europeans, are distinguished from New Brunswick down to Virginia by general cultural characteristics. They are agriculturalists, which means they plant and eat their food. They're not nomads. And the principal diet consists of the three sisters, or corn, beans, and squash, in addition to things that indigenous peoples would forage, clams, hunting, useful fruits or edible plants, these sorts of things. They encouraged foraging and encouraged the bounty of foraging through manipulating the landscape through the use of fire. Indigenous peoples have, throughout the continent and in South America as well, enriched their surroundings by the strategic use of fire to then encourage edge habitats, to encourage the return of fauna and flora that they wanted to be consuming. They were seasonally migratory, meaning that summer camps would be close to the water, winter camps, which were smaller in number, would be closer inland. Complex political systems involving tribute, involving interlocking kin obligations, and indeed webs of relations, not just among differing tribes and differing factions of tribes, but relations were recognized and responsibilities were recognized to non-human relations as well. So that's part of how we begin to understand the putative closeness of indigenous peoples to nature, is that there isn't an even divide or a neat kind of dichotomy between humans and non-humans. Non-humans were seen as agents and understood as being possessive of free will in many cases as well. And that became part of a kind of cosmovision, but also a political system that's when we think about, okay, if we want to decolonize, what might that mean? Perspective. So this is the kind of broader historical and cultural context. And then the pilgrims come, and I don't want to bore you with those details, just to say that it is important, again, for United States, and I would offer global history, that it's a Poconoke leader, the Massasoit Otsumqui, who treaties, who signs the first treaty with European settlers in North America. And it's a mutual defense treaty. It isn't a Kumbaya Thanksgiving treaty. It's a, Poconoke, we want to protect you, you'll protect us from what might be common threats further afield, further to the west and further to the north. So it was a mutual defense agreement. And it was in place for 54 years until the outbreak of King Philip's War, when Otsumqi's son, Potumtuk, known to us as Philip, he leads a coalition of indigenous nations, including former enemies of the Poconoke, like the Narragansett, in an uprising against English settlements in the United Colonies. And indeed, it almost worked. Many colonial settlements were burned. Many dozens, hundreds of people lost their lives. And in fact, if you do the calculations, King Philip's War remains the bloodiest contest, the bloodiest military war ever undertaken in North America in terms of per capita losses. So it was an existential threat. What King Philip, what Metacom was proposing was an existential threat to New England. And New England began to organize, and by the end of summer of 1676, had the Indigenous coalition on the ropes. And indeed, it was August 12th, 1676, that Metacom, this guerrilla warrior, this pan-Indigenous leader, was assassinated at, again, Potumtuk, 2 miles up the road. He had been hunted down by Colonel Benjamin Church, and was actually shot in the back by a Christianized Indigenous person who had been working with Church. He wasn't unique. Many Christian Indians, or so-called praying Indians, were also fighting on the side of the English during King Philip's War. So this was a tremendous event. Like the Sagamore said, early maps of the region, like this 1675 John Seller depiction, would show Poconoke country right about, this is Narragansett Bay right here, so right about in our neck of the woods, right? This map is quite old, so the cartography is a little bit aspirational or gesture, but you can see clearly their evidence. There are other maps that we could show as well. Here's a depiction from the 19th century, so already entering a kind of nostalgic mode for settler depictions of Indigenous warriors. But this is interesting because it sets up Metacom here with Potumtuk in the background, which, if you've ever looked over to Mount Hope, it doesn't look like that prominent a hill, but it was once prominent than it is now, and I'll get to that story towards the end. So the King Philip's War was an earthquake to New England society on both sides of the equation, right? And the Indigenous side, certainly, and also on the settler side. By colonial decree, like the Sagamore said, all Native people were removed first from Plymouth Colony, which is essentially everything east of where we are in Bristol, all the way over to, including the Cape, all the way over to the ocean. And males 14 years or older could be shot on sight, especially if they avowed Poconoke identity. But that's not the whole story, because in the 1670s and 1680s, in the aftermath of King Philip's War, many Poconoke survivors, those who weren't shot on sight or who fell during the war, were sold into slavery in Bermuda, in the Azores, possibly also into the Caribbean, possibly into the Carolinas. The research here is emerging even as we speak. We also know that others were sent to the Shetucket Reservation near Norwich, Connecticut, which is in Mohegan territory. And there they were put under the sort of stewardship of a Reverend, James Finch. And also were sort of not victimized, they were subject to Mohegan oversight as well. But the oral tradition is very clear that we never lost our identity, even though if we identified as Poconoke out loud, we could be shot, even though we were sort of, low on the ranking, right, in an Indigenous sort of refugee camp. We still knew who we were, and we still continued to preserve that identity. In addition, a group of Poconokets evaded being dislocated, they were able to resettle in an area now in Seekonk, Massachusetts. People who were with the warrior, the head warrior, Anawan, who was Pometicom's basically right-hand man during King Philip's War. He was captured by church, taken to Boston, sorry, and killed. But people who were with him at this last gasp, last moment of the King Philip War, actually settled in Seekonk, Massachusetts, far enough away from Plymouth and Boston and Providence, for that matter, to basically escape view. And their descendants are still, with us today and are part of the Poconoke Nation. So Poconoke oral history is very clear on this point, that with the turn of the 17th into the 18th century, beginning of the 1700s, they were forced to go underground and become effectively an invisible tribe. And just to kind of put some things in context, I know I'm talking about a lot of different places. This map, some of those places in southeastern New England. We've got Potumtuk right here, basically where campus is. We've got contemporary, federally recognized groups, Aquinnah and Mashpee Wampanoag, located on the Cape and Martha's Vineyard. Plymouth, of course, is over here. The Seekonk Indians, those descendants from Anawan, the Anawan captives, are here in Seekonk. The Shetucket Reservation out here in Norway. South Providence will figure importantly in the next chapter of Poconoke history, especially neighborhoods in and around Mashapaug Pond. And again, for reference, the Narragansett Reservation, the contemporary Narragansett Reservation, is here in Charlestown, Hopkinton area. Never through the centuries to come after King Philip's War did the Poconoke relinquish their identity or forget that Potumtuk, what we know as Mount Hope, is their spiritual high grounds. Now, Potumtuk itself was essentially seized by 4 Boston land speculators in 1680 by means of a turf and twig ceremony, which is a medieval land conveyance ceremony whereby you would dig a piece of turf ground out of the ground with a shovel, break a twig, put a little bit of money in the turf, where in the hole that you've dug, cover it back up. Someone else would come along, your business partner, take the money out, put the turf back down, and now the land to which you were referring is private domain. It's no longer terra nullius, or no man's land. It is private, and that's essentially how all of Bristol became able to be carved into house lots, able to be settled, right? With proprietors, with renters, with folks moving in, etc. Right? And so it was never sold, traded, or ceded by treaty. You could say it was conquered, but one would have to get into a kind of debate about the legal justification for that at the time and indeed to the present. So this is a very important point that comes out clearly in Poconoke understandings of Potumtuk, that it's a deeply important place. Again, a place of high council, a place of spiritual significance, but that it was stolen, never traded, sold, or ceded away. Moving ahead, in the late 1700s, so the 18th century, a notable descendant of Pometicom, his great-grandson, Simeon Simons, becomes a bodyguard, an aide-de-camp for General Washington during the Revolutionary War. He's, crossing the Delaware with George Washington in that very famous moment. Also spends the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge. So this is a man of some repute and renown whom Washington in his writings knows that Simons is Native American. He knows that he is Algonquin, as George Washington refers to him. Simons himself knew that he was a descendant, of course, of King Philip. I don't know, no one knows. We would only have to conjecture whether Simons ever vouchsafed that information to Washington. My guess is no, because of the fear associated with that name, Poconoke, that fear that was intergenerational by that time. Moving ahead 100 years, in the late 1800s, 1870s, 1880s, many of the Shetucket reservation Poconoke, who by that time had moved away from the Shetucket Reservation but were still in eastern Connecticut, began to move back to Rhode Island, in part to seek jobs in urban factories. And this is where Mashapaug Pond, the areas of South Providence, but other places and other cities in our region would be places where Native peoples, Poconoke people specifically, were relocating. As they do, they come under the realm, or come under the kind of watchful eye of census takers and sort of, the documentary needs of the state. So often folks at that time were, assuming that all the native peoples were gone from New England, because that's part of the kind of mythos, would see someone who was clearly presenting as maybe not white, right? And would write down colored or black, or sometimes white, but never a Poconoke, never, very rarely Native American. And so this kind of miscategorization as a function of the settler colonial assumptions about who you are and where you fit was definitely a part of this experience, the Poconoke experience at the time. But as I said, they never relinquished their identity or their connection to the line of Massasoit Otsumqui down through the present. Even though, much of the industrializing and urbanizing American experience in the 19th and early 20th century, there was very little room for indigenous people. In fact, our federal government was pursuing a policy of, save the man, kill the Indian inside him, right, through residential schools and these sorts of things, right? So there was an assimilationist attitude, if not in the Northeast, just a sort of blasé, hey, you couldn't possibly be Indian sort of response to Native peoples. Nevertheless, Native peoples began to find one another in the kind of cauldron of urbanization and industrialization, and intertribal powwows became a thing in the early 1900s. In the 1920s, an advocacy group came together with rural and urban Indians called the National Algonquin Indian Council, which advocated in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, and Connecticut, throughout New England for indigenous recognition, right? And they would sponsor powwows, they would sponsor conferences. Going forth a little bit, a few decades into the civil rights era, Native groups nationwide under the banner of Red Power began to demonstrate for their rights. And specifically in our region, again, bringing it up a little bit closer to the present, the Narragansetts organized and gained federal recognition in 1983. State recognition within Rhode Island is a whole different blacks, won't get into it. The Aquinnah Wampanoag gained federal recognition in 1987, and the Mashpee Wampanoag in 2007. The Poconoke began to organize among themselves locally here in Rhode Island, greater Rhode Island, really, in the late 1990s, and currently count 300 tribal members. They do not seek tribal recognition, federal tribal recognition. And that's for a variety of reasons that are really interesting and complex, but this isn't my story. I'm not the one to say that. We can get into it a little bit in the Q&A, but needless to say that their trajectory, their reemergence out of the shadows or out of the margins tracks with that of other groups, not just in New England, but throughout the country and indeed throughout the world. So, Sowams today, check the time. Yeah, we're good on time, I think. These are some of the areas that have deep indigenous history and contemporary meaning associated with them. I've already mentioned the Seekonk Indians, descendants of the Anawan captives up there in the northern part of the map. The 100-acre Cove and Sowams, these are sort of riverine sites that would have been important for building villages, but also for gardens, for foraging, for transportation. The Burrs Hill Park in Warren, it's a public park now. It's the burial ground, the royal burial ground of the Poconoke, Sachams, and Massasoits going back centuries. And then down here at Potumtuk, or Mount Hope, the spiritual high grounds of Poe-Matakam's assassination in 1676. Adjacent to it is a spiritual site called the Three Sisters, which I'll talk about in a second as well. You can visit these sites, and indeed one that you should visit is the Otsumqui Nature Preserve in Barrington. It is on the western side of Sowams, right? But the entire area is Sowams, and it is adjacent to the 100-acre Cove, which is part of the, if I'm not mistaken, Barrington River, or perhaps that's the Palmer River. But these were transportation lines, vital transportation lines for indigenous people going into the inland, seasonal migration, or conducting trade with other tribes and other political entities. rivers were, streams and rivers were the highways of Indigenous people. And the Otsumqui Nature Preserve is a great place to sort of connect with what some of Otsumquin 17th century landscape may have looked like, may have been like. Of course, the village site is no longer there, but you can imagine a mixed use kind of area or corridor as you visit. Burrs Hill, as I said, a public park in Warren. You wouldn't know anything about the significance of this place for the Poconoke people were it not for a marker recently placed by the Sowams Heritage Area Project, which is sort of coordinated by a friend of mine, Dave Weed, Dr. Dave Weed, in collaboration with the Poconoke tribe, to sort of bring to light what archaeologists have known and linguists have known and people who study this stuff have known for a long time, which is that Burrs Hill had been a royal burial ground for the Poconoke people for generations. And some of those burial sites were desecrated in 1854 when the Providence, Bristol, and Warren Railroad was built through the area. If you've ever been on the East Bay bike path, you have rolled through a burial ground as you go through Burrs Hill. And again, that was, you know, no fault to the bikers, no shade on the bikers, but it was part of a sort of development program in the mid-19th century that just wantonly kind of paved through an Indigenous burial ground. But you can go there today and visit and try to, again, with decolonized eyes or colonization, begin to connect with another way of being in place. Potumtuk, again, 2 miles away. It continues to be of vital importance and lived in place for the Poconoke people. It's a site of continued ceremonies, such as the one depicted here, the renewing of the covenant, which happens every spring. It's a way that the tribe comes together to connect with the place, to connect with the creator, to connect with the non-human elements that sustain our lives and our livelihoods. Here again is a depiction of the Sagamore sitting in the seat that his 9th great-grandfather, Pometacom certainly sat in, and his father, Massasoit Otsumqui, certainly sat in as well. Potumtuk is politically significant. It's historically significant because of King Philip's War, but it's also spiritually significant. These boulders, the 3 sisters, are explained as being reminders of the gifts of the Creator, specifically the story of how the Creator bestowed upon the Poconoke people, ancestral Poconoke people, the perennial gifts of corn, beans, and squash in the form of goddesses who came down and bestowed seeds and food on the people. And then as they were going away back to the Creator, left their mark on the shore so that no one could ever forget, no one could ever deny that corn, beans, and squash were gifts of the Creator. So these are the last footprints before the 3 sisters alight to rejoin the Creator. A place where the Poconoke celebrate several Nakomo lunar Thanksgivings, in addition to the renewal of the harvest, the Payanisi Warriors Walk, which is a type of vision quest. Many sacred rituals and happenings happen in this place, but they don't have title to this place, so they have to ask permission from the actual owners to even come onto the land. That in and of itself maybe is a talk for a different hour. I want to kind of almost wrap up now by just showing you Potumtuk from the sky. I mentioned earlier that it was taller than it is now. In 1956, a good 30 or so vertical feet of clearance of this rocky outcropped mountain, which is described in the colonial text as being like treeless at the top, that was shaved off to level off a Nike Ajax missile battery. These were anti-aircraft surface-to-air missiles that were installed all up and down the East Coast as part of an early warning system during the Cold War. And so you can see King Philip's seat. The arrow indicates approximately where it is. It's in the trees at the eastern base of the hill. The missile base that you see is actually up on top of the hill. And to the north, what's left on your screen, the arrow is pointing to the Haffenreffer estate, which is built by Rudolf Haffenreffer, a Brown University alum and philanthropist and industrialist who made his name first by brewing Narragansett beer back in the late 19th century up at the Jamaica Plain Brewery, which currently is condos, I think. In any event, made lots and lots of money, had a passion for antiquities, had a passion for Native American collections and paraphernalia. So he began a museum at his estate. And upon his passing, he deeded his many acres estate in addition to the Anthropological Museum to his alma mater, to Brown University. And to this day, much of what is depicted here is Brown University property. The Army decamped in 1974. There are some private residences up in that area of the hill these days. And then to the south, which is right on your screen, is the Mount Hope farm property, which is townland. Another interesting tidbit here is that this exact area down where the Haffenreffer estate is, and with stone's throw of King Philip's seat, the seat of Metacom, there was an amusement park, nothing more American than that, 1884 to 1901, which was accessible mostly to the Fall River clientele via a ferry that crossed Mount Hope Bay. Many Bristolians didn't really think too highly of an amusement park, and so they didn't make the trip over. Metacom Avenue at that time was a dirt path, right? So you didn't have Roger Williams University, it was still Ferrycliff Farm, and you didn't have the kind of 20th century development that you have along Metacom Avenue at that time. So, Bristol today. We clearly celebrate the colonial era. We celebrate US independence. We're loud and proud about that when it comes time for 4th of July. Right here on this welcome sign, which is basically on our campus. This is at the foot of the Mount Hope Bridge when you're going north. It says, "Welcome to Bristol, settled 1680. No mention of the turf and twig conveyance, no mention of land theft, but there is mention of the home of America's oldest 4th of July celebration. Now, I don't necessarily, I'm not a town booster. That's not my job. So, the folks who want to boost the town, they have their means and they have their reasons, and this is a perfectly fine welcome sign. If you keep digging and keep going throughout the town, though, you'll see plenty of kind of monuments and tributes to colonial figures, like this tablet on the right, erected by the Rhode Island Society of Colonial Wars in recognition of the exceptional services rendered by Colonel Benjamin Church, his fearless leadership, effective command during King Philip's War. He certainly was fearless, he was effective. King Philip died, the Indigenous insurgency was, and you've been caught up on that story. After King Philip's War, Benjamin Church continued to lead a relatively colorful life. He went up and fought in King William's War against the Abenaki, to great fame as well. And he was one of those original proprietors of Bristol, settled in 1680. In fact, Church Street, you might notice that there's no church on Church Street in Bristol because it's named after Benjamin Church. It's adjacent to a church, but it was originally laid out as in honor of Benjamin Church. So these are the ways in which, once we start to think about, okay, the very things that are the fabric of our society are themselves the after effects or the continually recreated effects of colonialism, then we can begin to understand how difficult it is to take on the information, to really think about the Indigenous perspective, because it's always already pushed to the margin. So one thing that we've been doing, and this is the last slide, we'll open it up. Again, over the past year, students of mine in the honors program and in the anthropology and sociology program, in partnership with the tribe, in partnership with the Friends of the Poconoke Collaborative, which is an interesting community and university collaborative that's sprung up in the past year here on campus. We've been trying to inform people here in the East Bay about this story, about the story of this invisible tribe. And the challenge, of course, is that many people have heard about King Philip's War, but they sort of think that's the end, right? That's the end of Indigenous issues here or Indigenous people, period, here in the East Bay of Rhode Island. Maybe they've heard about the Wampanoag in Mashpee. Maybe they've heard about casinos in Taunton. Maybe they've heard about the Equina. Certainly they probably heard about the Narragansett, and justifiably so, but the Poconoke continue in some ways to be an invisible tribe, occluded from the histories that we tell, in large part because of the continued legacies of colonialism and being continually punished for having the Poconoke leadership take that leading role in an anti-Indigenous or anti-colonial, insurgency in the King Philip's War. And so the booklet, which I encourage all of you to look at, there's also a website, maybe Professor Hendrickson shared it in the chat already, can give you some of this history and can give you other resources to consult about it as well. This is a long struggle to try to overcome what has been centuries really of misinformation or half-truths or settler colonial ideology, right? To try to attenuate that, address that, rework it is tough stuff. But there's room for everybody to do it. And so thank you all for listening to me do some of this work, again, from a settler's perspective. It's been my privilege and honor to speak to you all tonight. It's been my privilege and honor to bear some of the story that the Poconoke entrusted me with. So I want to thank the Sagamore, Winds of Thunder. I want to thank the Sachem Dancing Star, Tribal Council President, Running Deer. Thanks to Dave Weed, to Laura D'Amore, Laura Turner, Jason Jacobs, Margaret Everett, my students, the honors program, the Heritage Harbor Foundation, which helped us print all of these, and the Wuchiwami Living Culture Collaborative. Thank you all. And now we've got time for questions.
So I'm going to jump in here really quick just to make sure, because I got like 4 or 5 sentences of what I think are like really pressing or core questions that I'd like to pose to you, Dr. Campbell. The first one was actually one of our first questions that comes from Spencer Wright, and I think it's so important because ultimately this is about you learning about things as well too. And Spencer asked, what surprised you the most when conducting your research for this presentation? And what I'm thinking, I'm holding you to like 1 to 2 minute.
Sure. Good.
Okay? We've got like 4 or 5 good questions I want to ask you.
Yeah. What surprised me most, thank you, Spencer, for the question. What surprised me most was how underprepared I was as a professionally trained anthropologist to appreciate the political complexity, to appreciate the intergenerational trauma that not just Poconoke, but Indigenous people, especially in the East Coast, have had to confront, have had to deal with. The people with whom I work in the Amazon are being very clearly colonized, right? And there's a clear, like, look, those folks with guns want to kill us, right? Or the government wants to actively remove us from this place. Here, far more subtle, far more complicated. So that was, I wasn't prepared for that. I also wasn't prepared for the incredible generosity of our Indigenous interlocutors and collaborators in opening their homes, opening their hearts, their archives to the kind of work that my students and I and other people on campus are doing. So both of those things were kind of, wow, I don't know how to do this work, not prepared for it, but also, wow, here are people who are just incredibly generous.
Thank you. So I'm going to actually foreground a question from Connor Goggin that came later on, but I think it's important in terms of really thinking about the critical issues here. So, and also from a more historical perspective, as we get into more contemporary issues, is it as black and white as colonists came here and slaughtered natives, quote unquote, or did natives retaliate, and or was the peace for a significant amount of time?
Okay. I think the first way into it is to say, no, it's not as simple as colonists coming and slaughtering native peoples. In fact, for the generation and a half or 2 generations of English settlement, and for that matter, Dutch settlement, and for that matter, Swedish settlement, the 17th century up and down the East Coast, Spanish settlement in the Southeast, those colonial undertakings in North America were very fragile, very precarious. And, we have evidence that suggests that Indigenous sachems and leaders knew this. They knew that, we could eliminate these, right, early on, right? And so the peace was a mutually productive peace, the one at least between Otsumqui, right, the Poconoke Massasoit, and the early Pilgrims, that was a mutually productive, mutually beneficial piece. The problem was that, you know, within the next 50 years, 30 to 50,000 other English folks showed up, right? And, you know, Europe was sort of, you know, not overpopulated, but there was a population boom in Europe in the 17th and continued through the 18th and 19th century. So there were just many people. There were some technological advantages too that help explain kind of how a piece that was mutually kind of conducive and beneficial turned sour, right? I don't know if that addresses the question, but it is incredibly complicated. And you have to kind of understand that things are kinetic throughout history, right? At one particular moment, there might be a sort of collaboration or a kind of meeting of the minds. Wait a generation or two, and things may be very different because of economic, political, social, climatic changes. One of the main impacts, and this story is often not told, the main kind of ways through which the English colonized New England was by changing the landscape, by introducing pigs. Pigs would, you know, run wild and eat Native American gardens of corn, beans, and squash, leaving Native Americans with very little to eat. Of course, there's the introduction of new pathogens as well, which is a kind of ecological factor that was in the Europeans' favor. Introducing things like debt, introducing things like currency. Wampum is usually thought of as a currency, but it wasn't. It was a way of marking status, a way of actually making reciprocal relationships happen between and among Native peoples. It became debased as a currency once the Europeans arrived. And so that changed the ecology, and it changed the way in which folks were relating to their environment. So it was complex, to be sure.
So I'm going to jump ahead because we have a lot of questions about this, and I've tried to synthesize them all, and I'm not even going to read you the paragraph of my synthesis, but I'm going to say a lot of questions about mascots. Okay, and I think there's two major points. Is like, what do we do about mascots? Are people going to change their minds about mascots? And then also,
yes,
what happens when you have a tribe? And this is coming from somebody who was an undergrad at Florida State,
yeah,
Seminoles, right? That has a relationship with the university that seems to problematize, at least on a surface level, this idea that we should just say all Indigenous, American Indian, Native American mascots are problematic. We should get all rid of them. And then should we like, what do we do? What do we do? Do we say they're all bad? Do we have a more nuanced perspective? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, and I've thought a lot about this over the years. I think that our default should be to hear perspectives as opposed to go to a defensive mode, which seems to have been the way that defenders of the former mascot for the Washington football team always did it, right? It was like, we come with a defense. Part of being decolonial, or part of doing decolonial work, is really opening up to other perspectives and being willing to learn from them, and not searching for maybe the one or two, because this is something that the front office at the Washington football team always used to do. They would search for one or two people of Native American blood, right? And say, I find it to be respectful. And there you go. You're both sides it, right? Which is a terrible intellectual habit that 21st century North Americans learn early, and we have to unlearn, right? Because that's not, it's not he said, or he said, she said something different, and we agree to disagree, and we have this thing that does this kind of epistemic violence, right? Cartoonish mascots kind of normalize a cartoonish throwaway kind of regard for Native American realities. And so provided they're doing that work, they all got to go, in my view, right? Now, the interesting example of the Seminole, it's not unique to FSU. There are ones in Oklahoma. There are ones in certainly the Southwest. Mascots at the high school level, at the junior college level, at the college level, that are respectful and appropriate because they reflect the community itself. There's an open dialogue about who constitutes that community. There's an open, far more than just a land acknowledgement, an open partnership with people around and about these kinds of issues, to say nothing of Native Hawaiians and Native Alaskans as well, where where those kinds of things happen. But chiefs, warriors, these kinds of things. Look at the Golden State Warriors, right? They've certainly cleaned up their imagery, right? But they started as a racist and offensive. Almost all Warriors mascots started as 100 years ago, 120 years ago, super offensive, right? With the times they've changed, and maybe Warriors is fine, right? But it would be, I would invite all of you to, again, think of history as emergent, think of these things that happened in the past as not just being over with, but instead research the history of maybe your high school or, you know, some local mascot, and ask yourself if any Indigenous person was ever consulted, right? Ask yourself the general attitude towards Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples in your place, in your town, at the time that sports were established, which is probably the late 19th, early 20th century. And then you'll get a little bit of the mindset, a little bit of a glimpse into the threshold mindset at the start of competitive sports in your town. And maybe then there's a conversation about whether we want to continue this, or if we want to, again, set it in context, recontextualize it. I don't want to be sort of, you know, really stern about this, except to say that, you know, we do have to take this seriously and not just reject it as, oh, those people can't take a joke. That means if you respond in that way, I think you're not doing the best work you can to listen and open up to a different perspective.
All right, so I've got at least two more that I've tried to synthesize over the time, and for those folks who are spilling questions in, you know, we'll see if we can attend to those. But one of them is about, you know, what's happening at the K through 12 level to correct the way in which we conflate Wampanoag with Poconoke. So that's one level. The other part of this is how can we claim to be addressing these things when we still treat Thanksgiving the way we do, when we still call Columbus Day, yeah. And then, like, what can a normal person who's not hoping that they're beyond public education, the public education system is going to fix things for them, where do they go to be able to find out good information? So that's a huge question, and and I'm giving you like literally like 1 to 2 minutes. So tackle that.
So K to 12 is a vital strategic place, and it's a place that I think is relatively open. You know, nothing changes overnight, but through small victories, through, you know, a middle school history teacher who is interested in stuff and is interested in learning more, I think there can be a lot of success in correcting the record, not just a kind of distinction between Poconoke and Wampanoag, but really correcting on a fundamental level, teaching Indigenous issues in the present tense, which speaks to, I think, the concern with Thanksgiving. We tend to have we have cultural trappings and them associated with the day, but then we also teach about it. It's a hook in for a lot of middle school history, and it's just done really poorly and often leaves, if it leaves the learners with a sense of injustice having been perpetrated on Indigenous peoples, fine, that's good. But if it then says past tense and doesn't continue to talk about a vital portion of our republic, a vital thread in our national history, which is Indigenous communities, then we're doing a disservice. So that has to happen throughout the curriculum, and I think it can. I'm hopeful that that can happen. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen top down. It happens bottom up, community by community. It happens by taking resources like these and introducing these pamphlets and these resources to. I would say the internet offers us a lot of the ability to get this information. That's true, but the internet, you know, be careful, right? Because there's a lot of misinformation there too. So we have good tools for distributing information. There's some strategic places where we probably have to focus more. Part in the fact that these questions, this generation is more interested in issues of equity and justice and inclusion. You know, it's Halloween too, not being some kind of terribly racist, stereotypical Indigenous or etc. Sort of pantomime for Halloween. That's another place where we can nip it in the bud and just kind of expect better of other people too, I think.
So I'm going to try to combine two questions. One of them came very early on from Dr. Murphy, and then I think one of them is from Honor, one of our students, and I think maybe I can synthesize these. So Honor is asking, what do the Poconoke want us to do about this legacy of colonization? Do they want reparations? Do they want us to get off their land? And I think in an interesting connection to other issues that are going on, Dr. Murphy asked, like how, what, I'm going to read this. What is the word you would use to describe the parallel process between blacks and whites in our country? So like in this moment, for those of us who are white folks trying to attend to a legacy of racism and exploitation, like what are we, and I think that there's a unique question with Indigenous folks, and maybe there's a broader question about what we do to be anti-racist in this moment.
Right.
And would you be willing to maybe suss that out to sort of end the conversation for us tonight?
I would, yeah. Let me try to take the first one first. What do the Poconoke want? One thing that the Poconoke want that's very concrete is to not be ignored and to not be sort of treated in the past tense, right? And so how do we do that? We make sure that there are public events. We make sure that there are strategic ways of communicating with the broader public so that their story gets out there. Another thing that they want that's very specific and material is Potumtuk, Mount Hope. They want to not ask permission to go onto land that they see and that they've always understood as being their spiritual high ground. Whether that takes the shape of a reservation or a trust kind of arrangement, whether it's just Brown and the town's property and the Poconoke kind of manage it. I don't know, and no one knows, right? But the current situation is untenable for the Poconoke. And so, you know, if that matters to you, then pay attention to that story and do what you can going along, I think. And respecting that the tribe is in the driver's seat when it comes to that, right? There are no 18 to 22-year-old Roger Williams student saviors, right, for the Poconoke, right? But really taking on this story, repeating it, trying to analyze it, trying to converse about it, bringing it to light, that I think goes a long way. The broader resonance for, you know, Black Lives Matter and anti-racist work is that I think it's important that we all undertake, whether it's decolonization or anti-racist work. I mean, they certainly overlap, right? And maybe you could say one is squarely rooted in the other or vice versa. But I think it's especially important for dominantly positioned members of our society to speak out on this, to not lead, but to speak out and model that these kinds of ways of taking for granted settler truisms or white supremacist truisms about who we are as a people and what we value, they're here for white people. They're here for settlers. They're here for dominantly positioned people. So if you value diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, if you want to dedicate yourself to decolonial work or anti-racist work, you have to dismantle some of the things that have given you relative ease. Now, you can be creative about how that looks. And I'm not saying full-on communism, full-on anarchy, anything like that, but that we really do need to grapple with the kinds of assumptions that we might not know are stamped with white supremacy or that are stamped in colonial oppression. One quick example is how the hell, when the hell did it become okay for people born and educated in the United States to use the word America to refer to the United States? And many of you are probably like, what? I live in America, I'm American. Well, you live in the United States of America, right? And America is a word, it's an Eastern Hemisphere word that routes to Amerigo Vespucci that refers to North America and South America. And people grow up in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru, thinking of themselves as Americans, as distinct from Europeans, as distinct from, right? And so America doesn't mean just one thing, right? And so pluralizing our ability to understand that places have different stories, that peoples have different truths, right? But that at the end of the day, we can't just take our toys and go home if we don't agree with one another. The planet's getting hotter. There are a lot of us, and we got to get along. And so, how do we build that emotional vocabulary? How do we that empathetic sort of musculature to be able to connect with people, even if we're not the same, and establish some things and accomplish some things within a political society. right? I think that's the challenge. And decolonization gives us some of the tools to rework things so that we're more inclusive and more just. Anti-racism work does it as well. But it's for dominantly positioned people to play a big, not just, you know, okay, it's diversity hour, let's see, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and we'll sort of, you know, gently and politely clap and then not really consider our own stakes in the systems that we benefit from. That it? That's a wrap? Okay. Well, yeah, I see that we still have quite a few people here. Thank you very much for on. There are probably lots of other questions. You can hit me up at JM Campbell, JMCAMPBELL at rwu.edu. My office is down in Stonewall 4. Wear a mask, send me an email. We can set up a time to chat if you're curious and interested in these matters or in others as well. Again, I work in the Amazon, so if you're interested in the Amazon, hit me up there too. Thank you, Dr. Hendrickson. Thank you, Provost Everett. Thank you, Dr. D'Amore. Thank you, Dr. Turner. Thank you, Dean Jacobs. Thank you all. And thank you, Poconoke people as well for the trust you placed in me. Have a good night, guys.